She didn't arrive in silence. She came with headlines, photo ops, and promises of progress. A smiling face from a foreign land, standing in African villages, handing out gifts and praising leaders. To the public, she was an angel of charity. But behind closed doors, her real mission was something far more calculated and dangerous. This is the story of how one woman's secret plan unraveled right on stage, in front of ministers, media, and millions watching online. A trap set by Burkina Faso's president, Ibrahim Traoré. Not with weapons, but with patience, strategy, and truth. What you're about to see isn't fiction. It's a real turning point in how Africa defends itself, not just from armed forces, but from those who come smiling. But before we begin, tell us in the comments, what country are you watching from? And what time is it there right now? We're building a global community, and we'd love to see how far this story is traveling. If this is your first time here, welcome. We uncover powerful, real stories from across the globe, stories that challenge narratives and reveal what mainstream headlines often miss. So hit that subscribe button, tap the notification bell, and stay with us until the end. Because this is the kind of truth they don't want you to hear. She arrived as many foreign NGO leaders do, dressed in linen, camera-ready, and fluent in the language of compassion. Her name was Elise Laurent, and she was introduced on national television as the director of New Horizons, a European nonprofit claiming to champion girls' education and women's healthcare in underserved African regions. The public saw her as a symbol of modern humanitarianism, young, eloquent, and evidently devoted. Within hours of arriving in Ouagadougou, she was shaking hands with government ministers, smiling beside schoolgirls, and pledging her support for the youth of Burkina Faso. She moved quickly, as if on a tight schedule. In her first week, she visited 5 villages, bringing along solar-powered lamps, feminine hygiene kits, and stacks of school books. Cameras followed her every move, filming the smiles, the hugs, the staged gratitude. Her team was efficient. Local liaisons arranged media coverage, translators handled interviews, and a discreet assistant, always in the background, managed her schedule. The woman knew how to work a narrative. It's not about politics, she told one reporter. It's about people. Africa's daughters deserve better, and we are here to listen. On paper, it was a picture of altruism. But as her presence spread across the country, some officials and village elders started to whisper. Not out of hostility, but out of intuition. Something didn't sit right. Elise NGO had no prior track record of work in Burkina Faso, no partnerships with known local organizations, and no clear explanation for why she focused her efforts on regions known not for poverty, but for strategic significance. Areas near oil pipelines, drone surveillance stations, or military road checkpoints. Still, suspicion was tempered by diplomacy. She was polite. Her French was impeccable. She brought resources to places that needed them, and most importantly, she had international connections, ties to embassies, aid networks, and philanthropic circles. Questioning her motives too aggressively could invite backlash, or worse, accusations of xenophobia. So, people smiled back. They welcomed her, posed for photos, and nodded along to her rehearsed speeches. She'd played the role so well, it would take more than gut instinct to uncover the truth. Meanwhile, within the country's intelligence circles, a different picture was emerging. A week before Elise even landed, her organization had triggered alerts in a routine scan by the National Cyber Unit. New Horizons appeared in a classified report from another West African country, listed as an NGO that may have dual-use capabilities, meaning it offered humanitarian aid while simultaneously collecting geopolitical intelligence. Nothing had been confirmed, but its name was flagged. The IP addresses used by its staff linked back to servers in Paris and Brussels, some with encrypted traffic that suggested more than just logistics coordination. When the alerts were passed to the president's inner circle, Traoré gave a simple instruction: let her come. Let her do everything she came to do, but we will watch. And so they did. By the end of the second week, Elise had visited schools, market stalls, and maternity clinics. She gave a TED-style talk at a youth forum and posed for glossy magazine photos under the headline, "One Woman's Mission to Empower Africa." At every stop, she repeated the same message. This isn't about power, it's about dignity. But privately, she was more inquisitive than most aid workers. She asked village chiefs about road access. She inquired about army recruitment zones. She often arrived in remote towns unannounced, claiming flexibility, but always within 10 kilometers of critical infrastructure. Her staff rarely mingled with locals unless cameras were rolling, and her assistant, never named, never interviewed, was seen speaking on encrypted calls during the night. One evening, in a small town near the country's northern border, a woman named Awa, a midwife with no formal intelligence training, felt something shift. She didn't look at us like people, Awa said later. She looked through us, like we were just part of a plan. That same night, Awa sent a quiet message to her cousin, a junior officer in the capital. "Watch that woman," she wrote. "I don't think she's here for us." Unbeknownst to Awa, her instincts echoed what officials already suspected. But this grassroots warning helped accelerate things. The intelligence services began tracking Elise's digital footprint in real time. Her laptop had already been cloned by a local tech team during a hotel service visit. Her assistant's phone was being triangulated. Every email sent from her account now generated a mirror copy to a secure server monitored by Burkina Faso's defense unit. They didn't just want to know if she was a threat. They wanted to understand her entire network. What they found confirmed their fears. Elise had been emailing a person codenamed Delta Reeds, based in Côte d'Ivoire. Attachments included images taken near military installations, detailed notes on local base routines, and one chilling phrase: minimal resistance observed, ideal for silent entry. Her emails were filled with vague humanitarian terminology, but the metadata, taste marks, GPS tags, IP routing, told a different story. This wasn't a charity campaign. It was a reconnaissance mission disguised in soft words. Yet President Traoré still refused to act. "Not yet," he said. "She hasn't shown the world who she truly is, but she will." And that, precisely, is what set the stage for one of the most powerful public reckonings in African political history. On the surface, Elise Laurent was just another NGO worker doing good in forgotten corners of Africa. But people who watched closely started noticing things that didn't align with the role she claimed to play. She wasn't just interested in women's health or education. She was constantly asking questions that had little to do with development work. "How far is the nearest army base?" she asked a school principal during a lunch visit. "How often do military vehicles pass through this road?" she whispered to a market vendor. To outsiders, it sounded like harmless curiosity. But for those familiar with military operations, her questions carried weight. More troubling was her choice of travel locations. In just 2 weeks, Elise had been to 9 villages across different provinces. At first glance, it looked impressive, a woman on a mission. But the map told a different story. Each location she visited was within walking or drone range of strategic installations, fuel depots, military outposts, or drone surveillance towers. It was no longer coincidence. Intelligence officers tracking her movements saw a clear pattern. She wasn't choosing the neediest communities. She was selecting based on proximity to national defense assets. Then came the behavior of her assistant. Tall, quiet, always dressed in dark colors. Locals never caught his name. He never spoke in interviews, never appeared in group photos, but he was always on his phone, using what tech analysts later confirmed was a military-grade encrypted messaging app. At night, hotel staff overheard him speaking in a language they couldn't identify, possibly a coded dialect or phonetic encryption. In one case, he left behind a hotel keycard with a barcode that matched access credentials to a foreign embassy's communication network. Meanwhile, Elise herself operated with a dual dispatch setup. She carried a public phone used for calls, photos, and social media updates, but she also had a secondary device, one she rarely removed from her pocket. Surveillance teams eventually cloned both. What they found on the second device shocked them. GPS logs that didn't match her publicly posted routes, offline maps marked with red pins, and a notes app containing acronyms and unit names that only someone with military clearance would understand. The turning point came when she visited a town near the eastern border, close to an airstrip used by Burkina Faso's reconnaissance fleet. On that visit, she claimed to be delivering textbooks and lanterns, but footage from a roadside security camera captured her assistant photographing the airstrip at dusk using a lens designed for long-range surveillance. The photos were transferred via Bluetooth to Elise's private phone minutes later. Back at headquarters in Ouagadougou, the cyber unit worked overtime. They decrypted a series of messages sent from Elise's device to a contact named MH. Each message contained vague references to locations and timing, but one in particular stood out. Confirmed, daily activity between 5:30 to 6:15 a.m., no ground patrol after 20 o'clock. Route clear from entry point north. It was the kind of detail that had nothing to do with education or public health and everything to do with infiltration or coordinated monitoring. Despite the growing evidence, there was still no public move against her. President Traoré's team knew one thing. To make the exposure undeniable, it had to happen in front of the world. So the monitoring continued. Elise attended diplomatic brunches. She gave passionate talks about youth empowerment, but every step she took was now a recorded move on a digital chessboard. And the trap was drawing tighter with every passing day. Even among her admirers, doubts were surfacing. A young local journalist named Mariam, who had initially covered Elise's early visits, began to feel uncomfortable. She never answered real questions, Mariam later said. She talked like she was selling something, not like someone who actually wanted to understand this country. When Mariam asked Elise why her organization wasn't working in the western regions where maternal health needs were more urgent, Elise smiled and said, "We go where the light leads us." But the light seemed to always shine near high security areas. The final straw came not from a government agent, but from a village chief named Idrissa. When Elise visited his town with cameras in tow, she spent most of her time not in the clinic or school, but on a small hill overlooking the main road where fuel convoys passed. Later that night, she made a call from that same hilltop, using a satellite modem linked to a non-commercial frequency. Unknown to her, a Burkinabe signal unit picked up the transmission. It was brief, but the message was clear. Route 7, open, weak clear, no interference. When this data reached the president's office, the pieces clicked into place. Elise wasn't just documenting, she was coordinating. Each movement, each meeting, each photo opportunity had a secondary objective: to observe, to record, and to transmit. And all of it had been done under the cover of goodwill, framed by charitable intentions, and applauded by those who had trusted her. But trust was no longer on the table. Behind closed doors, the national security team began preparing a different kind of event. Elise was to be honored as a guest speaker at an upcoming conference on African sovereignty. The invitation was extended with full diplomatic protocol. She accepted without hesitation, and why wouldn't she? To her, it was the culmination of her success. To them, it was the opening move of the final act. While Elise continued her mission under the banner of charity, Burkina Faso's intelligence network was operating in full gear, quietly, efficiently, and with long-term strategy. They weren't just collecting fragments, they were building a complete picture. Every village Elise entered, every device she carried, every encrypted call she made was being recorded, mirrored, and mapped in real time. This wasn't about catching her red-handed in a single act. It was about revealing a pattern so undeniable that even her most powerful backers couldn't refute it. The president's private security team, trained in counter-espionage with support from regional defense allies, had set up a digital perimeter around her. They had previously used this method against known surveillance groups operating under journalistic or diplomatic covers, but never on an NGO leader this high profile. In Elise's case, they took it one step further. Not only did they clone her laptop and phones during routine hotel maintenance, they also intercepted network traffic in every accommodation she stayed at. Her VPNs were bypassed, her emails rerouted, and her private cloud storage silently copied. Within days, they had access to her travel logs, meeting notes, voice memos, and even drafts of reports she hadn't yet sent. It became clear that Elise wasn't just observing military patterns. She was building a strategic overlay of Burkina Faso's entire defense network, piece by piece. Her documents labeled civilian zones, estimated soldier rotations, cataloged fuel transport cycles, and even included suggestions like utilize market days for surveillance cover and leverage women's health programs to access restricted districts. But what shocked analysts most was the tone of her internal messages. There was no humanitarian warmth, no advocacy language. Her writing was clinical, coded, and operational. A message to Delta Reads read, "Target perimeter expanding, western corridor susceptible to disruption within 48-hour window." Another, to Melvin, referenced BF route overlays with updates about supply chain vulnerabilities and communications infrastructure. She wasn't acting alone. She was clearly part of a broader network, one that understood military timing, risk calculation, and infiltration strategy. President Traoré was briefed daily, but still, he said the same thing. Not yet. Let her build her confidence. Let her believe she's invisible. As the third week unfolded, Elise's public profile soared. International publications began to mention her as a rising figure in development work. Her social media following grew. She was featured in a regional magazine under the headline, "Hope in Human Form." She used this exposure to access more high-level contacts, secure meetings with ministers, and appear on joint panels with respected activists. Ironically, the more visible she became, the more blind she was to the eyes already on her. At the same time, her assistant's communications exposed deeper threads. His messages were routed through a NATO-linked server based in Côte d'Ivoire, under a shell NGO registered to a defunct cultural research fund. His encrypted calls included references to clearing queue lines, observation logs, and discretion thresholds. It was language known only to those with military or intelligence experience. Investigators were no longer asking if this was espionage, they were debating who was really behind it. Then came a pivotal moment. One night, Elise sent a batch of files using a mobile modem while staying in a quiet guest house near Gaoua, a town far from media attention but strategically located near border patrol lines. The email contained a highly detailed map labeled B Field de Cecil V2, a name that had already been referenced twice in her earlier messages. The file showed red markers over key military installations, drone towers, convoy lanes, and observation posts. Unknown to Elise, the file had already been copied mid-transfer. In fact, the moment she clicked send, a parallel version was instantly relayed to a military command node in the capital. President Traoré viewed it within minutes. He didn't speak. He simply studied the pattern and said to his advisor, "She just confirmed everything we thought, and now the world will see it for themselves." Behind the scenes, planning began for a public exposure, not a press release, not a quiet arrest, but something far more symbolic. A national forum on African sovereignty had been in preparation for months. Traoré's team accelerated its timeline, reorganized its schedule, and placed Elise, at her own request, on the final panel titled, "How Foreign Partnerships Empower Africa." The irony was profound. The very person gathering intelligence under the guise of partnership would now speak on the global stage, watched by students, diplomats, and press from around the world. The team managing the event made sure the cameras were ready, the screens operational, and the files queued for broadcast. No actor could write a script more poetic. Elise was about to face the one thing her training hadn't prepared her for: public truth. As the event neared, Elise remained confident. Her tone in private messages became bolder. She asked Melvin for extraction protocol options in case of NGO ejection. She joked about her impressive list of photo ops, and noted that the West Corridor data is sufficient to model full engagement simulation. She even scheduled meetings in Abidjan the following month to discuss Phase 2. What she didn't realize was that Phase 1 had already ended, and not on her terms. By now, Elise was being tracked not just digitally, but physically. Her drivers were vetted, her hotel staff briefed. Even the makeup artist for her public appearances was a trained observer, reporting back to national security. The entire country was quietly turning her own tools of surveillance against her. The longer she smiled, the deeper she stepped into the spotlight. And that spotlight was no longer for admiration, it was for accountability. The National Conference on African Sovereignty was already a landmark event. Months in the making, it had attracted leaders, youth delegates, journalists, and civil society groups from across the continent. The goal was to foster a new era of partnership on Africa's terms, one that emphasized dignity, transparency, and regional resilience. In that spirit, the organizing committee had been flooded with requests from international NGOs wanting to participate, and Elise Laurent's name had quickly risen to the top. With her polished media presence and reputation for hands-on humanitarian work, she was granted a coveted speaking slot on the closing panel. How Foreign Partnerships Empower Africa. What Elise didn't know was that every step leading up to this moment had been part of a slow, meticulous setup. Her selection as a guest speaker wasn't just allowed, it was orchestrated. The same officials who approved her application were the ones building the digital case against her. The same public relations team that helped coordinate her arrival at the event had pre-loaded the evidence onto the main stage projection system. Every line in the program, every camera angle, every seat in the front row had been chosen with precision. Burkina Faso wasn't just going to expose her. They were going to do it symbolically, peacefully, and unforgettably. The day of the conference arrived, and the capital was buzzing. Flags lined the streets, music played in city squares, and news anchors broadcast live coverage of the event. Elise appeared early in the morning, dressed in a brightly colored African-inspired outfit, smiling confidently. She greeted fellow attendees, posed for photos with young activists, and recorded short videos praising Burkina Faso's commitment to female empowerment. Her charm was on full display. She looked, for all intents and purposes, like a celebrated guest of honor. Inside the assembly hall, security was heightened, but discreet. Plainclothes officers monitored entry points. Cybersecurity experts sat backstage with direct control over the screens and sound systems. A military protocol unit coordinated with the Presidential Guard to ensure immediate response if needed. But President Traoré had insisted, no handcuffs, no arrests on stage, no chaos. Let the truth be louder than any order, he had said. The aim wasn't vengeance. It was clarity. The first half of the conference moved swiftly. Ministers discussed regional cooperation, university students shared research on post-colonial development, panelists debated technology, infrastructure, and ethics in foreign aid. Elise sat among them, occasionally nodding, taking notes, and preparing her remarks. Her assistant remained nearby, silent as always, observing the room with subtle tension, but even he seemed unaware that they were surrounded by operatives, documenting every move. Then came the final session. Elise's name was announced as one of the closing speakers. The crowd clapped politely. A banner above the stage read, "Our voice, our future." She rose gracefully, adjusted her scarf, and stepped onto the stage to soft applause. With practiced rhythm, she began. Africa is not a place of poverty. It is a place of power, of people, of potential. Cameras zoomed in. Journalists scribbled notes. Her words were smooth, confident, rehearsed. She continued. Partnership, to me, is not about control. It's about trust. It's about respect. We don't bring answers, we come to listen. The audience nodded. A few even smiled. It sounded right. But then, something shifted. From the third row, President Ibrahim Traoré stood up. There was no fanfare, no announcement, just movement. He walked calmly toward the front of the stage, flanked by no security, with his hands behind his back. The moderator stepped aside. The room quieted. Elise's eyes widened, but she kept smiling. "Mr. President," she said, bowing her head slightly. Traoré didn't speak into a microphone. He simply looked at her and asked, "Madame Laurent, may I ask you a few questions, in the spirit of transparency?" She nodded hesitantly. "Of course," she said. But the smile was slipping. The screen behind her flickered. Then it lit up. Not with a slogan, not with her slides, but with a file titled Beef Field Saloon V2PF, the same map she had secretly sent from her hotel room 2 weeks prior. Red markers glowed across the country. Military routes, drone posts, border zones. She turned and froze. Her face paled. The room gasped. Traoré stepped forward and said calmly, "Do you recognize this file?" Elise stammered, I'm not sure. It looks like logistics data? Perhaps a misunderstanding?" She looked toward the organizers, but no one moved. The silence was immense. And then the screen changed again. Now it displayed an email from elise.laurent@newhorizons.ngo. Subject, West Corridor. Minimal resistance observed. Body. Leverage school visits to verify drone presence. Route patterns stable. Continue phase. There was no longer any room for doubt. The audience turned. Foreign diplomats leaned forward. Journalists began filming on their phones. Traoré didn't raise his voice. You came here saying you believed in partnership. But these are not the words of someone offering help. These are the words of someone gathering intelligence under the guise of empathy. Elise tried to interrupt, but the evidence kept coming. Emails, message logs, surveillance images. One mother in the audience whispered, "She took photos of my daughter." Another stood and shouted, "You used our trust to plan something else." Elise stepped back from the podium, visibly shaking. "This isn't what it looks like," she said. "I swear, I was gathering information for funding purposes." But no one believed her anymore. The performance had ended. Traoré stepped aside. Two plainclothes officers approached, not with handcuffs, but with presence. They didn't touch her. They simply stood next to her, waiting. Elise looked at the president. "Please, not like this," she whispered. But it was already done. Traoré turned to the audience and said only one sentence. "They used to come with guns, now they come with smiles. But the mission hasn't changed." And just like that, the spell broke. The conference continued, but Elise was no longer part of it. The moment the evidence appeared on the screen, the tone in the assembly hall shifted. The polite applause that had accompanied Elise's entrance was now replaced by a deafening silence. Eyes widened, mouths hung open, and the energy that once praised her turned into a collective reckoning. She stood frozen, her hands gripping the sides of the podium. The audience, composed of community leaders, university students, foreign delegates, and journalists, sat in stunned disbelief. This was no longer a conference. It had become a tribunal. Elise's assistant, seated in the third row, instinctively reached for his phone, but security had already jammed the signal in the room. His exit routes were quietly blocked by plainclothes operatives. For the first time in 3 weeks, he looked unsettled. On stage, Elise's voice faltered. "I assure you, this has all been a misunderstanding," she said, trying to hold on to the polished tone she had perfected. Those documents were taken out of context, but President Traoré did not respond with anger. Instead, he calmly walked to the center of the stage, picked up a handheld mic, and addressed the room. "Context is earned through honesty," he said, "and context cannot erase intent." He turned to Elise and asked again, "Do you deny that this email came from your device?" She hesitated. "I don't remember sending that exact message," she said softly, "but it's possible that someone else may have." The crowd responded before Traoré could. Boos and murmurs began rising. Some stood up. A journalist yelled from the back, "You lied to every village you visited." A mother of 2, whose town Elise had toured, held up a photo of her children on a projector screen, taken during one of Elise's so-called health assessments. Her voice trembled with anger. "You used them! You used all of us!" Elise backed away from the podium, eyes darting toward the exits. But there would be no escape. Not here, not from this. More files were displayed, metadata from her encrypted messages, GPS timestamps proving she had visited military-sensitive zones on days she claimed to be at schools, and a file recovered from a hidden USB stick disguised as a lipstick tube, containing satellite images and drone surveillance grids. The level of detail was beyond what any aid worker should have, much less require. In the control room behind the stage, intelligence agents monitored reactions in real time. They observed body language, crowd sentiment, and Elise's every twitch. But they had no need to intervene. The court of public opinion was already in session. And the verdict was clear. Traoré, ever the strategist, chose this moment to step back and let silence do the work. The more Elise tried to explain, the more hollow her voice sounded. Her tears came next, real, visible, streaming across her face. But they arrived too late. "We believed in you," a university student whispered near the front row. "We thought you cared." Elise turned to him, her voice barely audible. "I do care. I came here to help." But no one was listening anymore. She was no longer the guest of honor. She was no longer the smiling humanitarian. She was the face of betrayal wrapped in benevolence. After several minutes, the moderator announced an unscheduled intermission. As attendees filed out, whispering and shaking their heads, Elise remained on stage, surrounded by a quiet that roared louder than any protest. She was escorted backstage by 2 officers, not forcibly, not with disgrace, but with the solemnity of someone whose secrets had run out of places to hide. Backstage, she sat in a small holding room with plain white walls and no cameras. There was no screaming, no confrontation, just stillness. A government official handed her a printed transcript of her own communications. "You will be given a formal hearing," he said. "But the people have already seen what matters." Elise didn't respond. She just stared at the papers, mouth slightly open, eyes glazed with disbelief. It was the expression of someone realizing they had underestimated the very people they claimed to serve. Meanwhile, across the city, and soon the continent, clips from the event were spreading like wildfire. Every media outlet ran headlines: "Humanitarian or operative, Western NGO leader exposed at National Assembly." On social media, hashtags exploded: "The smile that spied," "Truth on stage," "Africa unmasked." Young Africans began uploading their own videos, calling for a new era of vigilance. "We welcome allies," one post read, "but not those who walk among us with false intentions." In the hours that followed, the diplomatic fallout began. Embassies made calls, NGOs issued statements. A few claimed it was all a misunderstanding, while others distanced themselves entirely. But no one could explain the map. No one could explain the USB. No one could undo the footage of Elise standing on stage with her own emails on a giant screen behind her. The narrative had already cemented itself, not through propaganda, but through undeniable fact. President Traoré refused all interview requests that day. Instead, he issued a single statement, published in full. "We do not reject the world. But we will no longer accept masks in place of truth. If you come to build with us, come with honesty. If you come to study us, do so with permission. But if you come to control us behind kind eyes and clever names, you will leave exposed." By nightfall, Elise was relocated to a secured compound on the outskirts of the city. No charges were filed immediately, no photos were released. But the damage, reputational, geopolitical, emotional, was already done. She was no longer a free agent. She was a symbol of how Africa, long portrayed as passive, had just flipped the script. As the news of Elise's exposure rippled across international media, foreign embassies in Ouagadougou quickly moved into crisis mode. Within hours, Burkina Faso's Ministry of Foreign Affairs received a flurry of urgent requests for diplomatic meetings. The first came from the embassy of a neighboring country, where Elise's organization had maintained an official regional office. Their representative, speaking in carefully chosen words, suggested a quiet resolution in the interests of maintaining bilateral cooperation. "She may have overstepped," the diplomat admitted, "but surely this matter can be handled discreetly." President Ibrahim Traoré refused the meeting. His message was clear. This was no misunderstanding, and it would not be buried in bureaucracy. "Our people were deceived," he told his advisors, and now they deserve clarity, not silence. The refusal sent a ripple through diplomatic circles. More calls came in. One from a senior official at a European development agency warned of potential aid complications if the matter wasn't resolved sensitively. Another suggested that perhaps Elise had acted independently, without oversight from her NGO's leadership. Yet Traoré remained unmoved. At no point did he raise his voice. There were no press stunts or fiery press conferences, just firm silence. A line had been crossed, and it would not be walked back with apologies crafted in foreign capitals. In his view, this was not just about Elise. It was about what she represented, a larger pattern of foreign interference disguised as partnership, a long history of outside actors disguised as partnership, a long history of outside actors using soft power, charity, culture, media as a gateway to influence and control, and for Burkina Faso, this would be a turning point. Traoré convened his Security Council behind closed doors. They reviewed the digital evidence again, reaffirmed the chain of custody, and double-checked all surveillance logs. Everything was solid. Then he instructed his team to draft a formal declaration. Elise Laurent was to be barred permanently from Burkina Faso and any allied Sahel state. Her organization's operations would be suspended pending investigation. Most importantly, no arrest would be made unless further evidence linked her to active sabotage or espionage that crossed military thresholds. "We do not need to parade her in chains," Traoré said. "The truth is enough." The statement was released to national media in 3 languages, French, English, and more, to ensure every citizen understood what had occurred. It made no personal attacks, it named no government, but it laid out the facts, the timeline, and the evidence without exaggeration. And it closed with a quiet but powerful phrase: "Trust, once broken, must be rebuilt with more than smiles." International reactions were mixed. Some Western outlets attempted to downplay the incident. A French newspaper ran a headline calling the exposure a cultural misunderstanding. A US-based NGO stated that Elise's data collection was part of a larger monitoring project for grant effectiveness. But these statements fell flat in the face of the visual proof now etched into the public's memory. No one could unsee the maps. No one could deny the emails. And most importantly, no one could forget the look on Elise's face as her plans collapsed in full view of the world. In the days that followed, pressure mounted. A high-ranking official from a European government placed a private call to President Traoré. He opened with polite formality, praising Burkina Faso's leadership and then urging that the situation be closed with dignity. Traoré listened patiently. Then he responded with the same calm tone that had now become his signature. "If by dignity you mean silence, then no, because that is not dignity. That is erasure." The line went quiet. Later that week, a delegation arrived in Ouagadougou, seeking a last-minute meeting. They offered new funding packages, technical aid, and even proposed a joint press conference to highlight lessons learned. Traoré declined. He had no interest in salvaging public relations optics. Instead, he directed his attention inward, toward the people of Burkina Faso. He began visiting villages Elise had traveled through, not with cameras or speeches, but with listening sessions. He sat with elders, spoke with teachers, and heard from mothers who had once hosted Elise in their homes. "What did she say to you?" he asked. "What did she promise?" Their stories matched perfectly with what had been found on her devices. But more importantly, they revealed something else: how deeply people wanted to believe in hope, and how painful it was when that hope was weaponized. For Traoré, the incident became more than a matter of state. It was personal. It challenged the very fabric of trust his government had worked to rebuild, so he ordered the creation of an internal review process for all foreign NGO operations, not as a crackdown, but as a redefinition. We must know who walks among us, he said, not to push them away, but to make sure they are truly here for us. The international community responded with caution. Some criticized the transparency as hostile. Others praised the restraint and leadership Traoré had shown. But among African leaders, a different reaction was spreading. Respect. Quiet calls came from other capitals, Ghana, Mali, Senegal, asking for briefings on how the exposure had been managed. A few even requested copies of the internal review protocols being developed. It became clear that Traoré had not just exposed one operative. He had established a new playbook. A week after the event, a televised town hall was broadcast from the University of Ouagadougou. Traoré stood before hundreds of students and said, "They will ask us to forget. They will offer new funds and use new faces. But we remember, and we learn." The applause was thunderous. Behind the scenes, Elise remained under observation, now in a government facility just outside the city. She was not mistreated, no press were allowed in, but she was no longer in control of her story. The narrative had passed to the people she underestimated. The same people who had once smiled at her, welcomed her, and now stood united in disappointment. And in that quiet shift, from passive recipient to active judge, Burkina Faso had redefined the rules of engagement. What began as the exposure of a single individual soon evolved into something far greater, a cultural reckoning, a turning point in how African nations saw themselves and how they chose to be seen. Across Burkina Faso and beyond, Elise Laurent's name was no longer discussed as merely a person, but as a symbol, a warning, a lesson, a line in the sand. In the capital, murals began appearing overnight. One near the university showed a faceless woman with a microphone in one hand and a spy drone in the other. Underneath it, a caption read, "They came with promises, they left with our secrets." Students held impromptu poetry nights. Songs were written. One spoken word artist went viral with a performance titled "Smiles Without Soul," delivering lines like, "She said she brought change, but she measured our trust in megabytes." These weren't government-ordered responses. They were grassroots reactions. Raw, creative, and deeply personal. Social media across the continent lit up with hashtags like Africa Unmasked, We Are Watching, and No More Soft Spies. Young people who had once been skeptical of their governments now found themselves defending their sovereignty in a new way. Not through conflict, but through clarity. "We are not paranoid," one Ghanaian user posted. "We're just done being naive." Even traditional leaders joined the chorus. A respected elder from the north declared during a village gathering, "Let this be the last time someone comes dressed in kindness but brings chaos in her pocket." Radio stations replayed segments of Traoré's speech. Community forums held discussions on NGO accountability. What might have once been dismissed as a one-off scandal had now become a generational shift in awareness. And yet, amid this wave of awakening, there was no mob mentality, no calls for violence, no demonizing of foreigners. That was the most striking part, the maturity. The movement wasn't about hatred, it was about self-respect. Traoré had made it clear from the beginning. This wasn't a war against the world, it was a demand for honesty within it. And the people responded not with fire, but with vision. The universities responded first. Panels were organized across campuses to evaluate how foreign aid programs operated in their regions. Students studied NGO charters, tracked funding flows, and examined case studies of past development missions that had yielded suspicious results. One law student suggested, "What if we had an African accreditation board for all international NGOs, just like we do for universities?" The idea caught fire. Soon after, an editorial in a Pan-African journal proposed the formation of an independent continental body to audit foreign organizations claiming to support development, education, or health care. "We do not reject collaboration," the author wrote, "but cooperation without transparency is no longer acceptable." By the end of the month, a conference was scheduled in Dakar to begin laying the foundation for exactly that. Meanwhile, Elise, who had once occupied center stage, was no longer a focus of the conversation. She had become irrelevant, forgotten not out of mercy, but because the movement had grown bigger than her. She was no longer the headline. The story now belonged to the people who had stood, questioned, and reclaimed their narrative. Her image, once plastered across NGO websites and glossy brochures, was now a reminder that the real face of progress is not imported, it's homegrown. International media began to shift tone. Initial skepticism about Traoré's methods softened as investigative journalists confirmed the validity of the documents. Some outlets even published op-eds calling for better oversight of foreign interventions. One UK paper admitted, "We've celebrated too many heroes without asking who gave them the right to be one." But for many Africans, that realization had already taken root. Trust would no longer be given freely. It would have to be earned. And the next Elise, who came with smiles, speeches, and satellite gear, would find herself watched, questioned, and possibly exposed. Quietly, calmly, decisively. In a televised interview weeks later, President Traoré was asked what he hoped the world had learned from the incident. He paused before answering. "That Africa is not asleep," he said. "We are awake. We are aware, and we are no longer flattered by attention that comes without respect." The interviewer followed up, "Do you think this will change anything long-term?" Traoré nodded. "It already has. Look at the students. Look at the streets. We have not just protected our borders, we have protected our dignity. And we will do it again and again until no one dares come with a mask, thinking we won't see the face behind it." Months after the incident, Burkina Faso had returned to its routine rhythms. Markets reopened, schools resumed, and ministries moved forward with their work. But underneath the normalcy, something fundamental had shifted. The story of Elise Laurent no longer dominated headlines. Yet its impact echoed everywhere, from rural villages to regional conferences, from social media feeds to government policy rooms. Her exposure had set off a wave not just of awareness, but of action. It was no longer about her. It was about the system that enabled her, and the awakening that followed. In the University of Ouagadougou, a new elective was introduced: Sovereignty in the Age of Soft Power. Students dissected NGO case studies, learned how surveillance can wear the mask of charity, and debated ethical frameworks for foreign aid. In a hall once used for general lectures, a mural now stretched across the back wall, a map of Africa, surrounded by watchful eyes, with the words, "If they come, let them come true." It wasn't a rejection of outsiders, it was a reminder that partnership requires accountability. Meanwhile, the president's administration launched the CLEAR Initiative, short for Community-Led Evaluation for Aid and Relief. Under this program, any foreign organization operating in the country must undergo periodic, transparent evaluations, led not by external auditors, but by local community boards, made up of teachers, health workers, and youth leaders. The goal was simple: to ensure that help served the people, not agendas. Traoré's government also expanded its digital infrastructure to protect against foreign data harvesting. Several ministries began collaborating with local universities to train cybersecurity specialists who could detect and counter embedded surveillance efforts hidden in aid-based operations. And beyond the borders, other Sahel nations began adopting similar models. Mali launched an NGO verification agency. Ghana announced a joint West African policy summit on ethical foreign engagement. What started as an isolated scandal had matured into a continental recalibration. But for the people of Burkina Faso, the true legacy wasn't in policy. It was in trust. In how elders began asking new questions when foreign teams arrived. In how students began fact-checking the missions of visiting experts. In how mothers in remote villages no longer hesitated to speak up when something felt off. For decades, the narrative had been, Africa must be helped. Now the narrative was, Africa must decide who helps and how. And as for Elise Laurent, she was never arrested, never paraded, never made a spectacle. She was quietly deported, blacklisted from re-entry, and forgotten by the very institutions that once celebrated her. Her NGO quietly removed her name from its website. Former colleagues gave neutral statements. There were no apologies, only distance. She vanished from the public eye not because she was silenced, but because her story had been absorbed, examined, and moved past. In her place, a new figure emerged, not one person, but a collective identity. The image of a continent no longer tolerating performative allyship, no longer clapping for speeches while secrets are stolen backstage. The power of Elise's fall wasn't in how loud it was, but in how irreversible it became. Trust was no longer assumed, it had to be earned. And that shift, though invisible, would shape the next generation of partnerships. Weeks later, President Traoré was invited to deliver a keynote speech at the African Union's Youth Assembly. He spoke not of the Elise affair, but of the future. Our nations, he said, are not empty vessels to be filled by outside wisdom. We are voices. We are visions. And the next time someone comes offering help, we will listen. But we will also look closely, clearly, and without apology. The crowd erupted in applause. Not because of the man on stage, but because of what his words represented. A new Africa. One that knows the cost of silence. One that refuses to trade dignity for aid. One that doesn't burn bridges, but builds them, brick by verified brick. But long after the microphones were switched off and the crowd had gone home, young students wrote his words on whiteboards, posted them online, and whispered them into late-night conversations. We are no longer waiting to be discovered, we are defining ourselves. This wasn't just a story about one woman. It was a story about a continent drawing a line, quietly, confidently, and without fear. In a world where foreign influence often hides behind soft hands and soft words, Africa didn't shout back. It simply stood up and said, "We see you." If this story moved you, made you think, or challenged the way you see global aid, let us know in the comments. What would you have done if you were in President Traoré's place? Do you believe more countries should expose these hidden operations publicly? And hey, if you want more stories like this, real stories, stories that don't make the front page but should, then subscribe to the channel right now. Don't forget to tap the notification bell so you'll never miss when the truth speaks louder than the headline. Until next time, stay aware, stay sharp, and stay proud of the power of truth.